The webinar, the webinar is going to be recorded. The replays are going to be on the ATT&CK YouTube channel, and then throughout the we'll call it discussion. There's going to be, full availability to ask questions, and then we'll respond to any questions that participants have throughout. So please go ahead and use that QA function, and we welcome questions, as we're kind of discussing each of these topics. So go ahead and feel free to ask at will. All right. So with that, let me get this set up here. All right, so what Shane and I would like to go ahead and dive into, obviously, is our experiences around threat hunting. But before we do that, we'll go ahead and do some light introductions, and then we'll be on our way. My name is Justin Vaicaro. I'm on the incident response team. I do heavy set of the threat hunting with the team here, help develop the threat hunting training content that we have, engagements that we work on, building out the services, or the service as it is. Been in the industry, man, I think a little over 20 years, certification soup, in my background. Also have 12 years military background. I've got 4 years with the Air Force right out of high school, and then 8 years with the Marine Corps after that. A little bit backwards for those who are the military community. Yeah, so that's my background. I'll turn it over to Shane.
Thanks, Justin. My name is Shane Hartman. I'm also a senior consultant here at ATT&CK doing incident response and threat hunts and the type of things that go along with that particular area. I've been in the industry for about 30 years, started out as just a desktop jockey and worked my way up through networking, programming, then security, all the way up into where we are currently at incident response. So that's kind of like, really in a nutshell, all the areas that I've worked in. Back to you, Justin.
Cool. All right, everybody. So Shane and I are gonna, hopefully have just kind of I don't know, we'll call it 2 cups of coffee and a discussion here today. So hopefully you enjoy it, you participate with us. But just to give you a premise of what we're going to be talking about, hopefully we're going to be kind of diving into what our threat hunting engagements look like, the types of things we run into with clients. I would say one of the topics that we really want to drive home is looking at, most of our clients are looking at threat hunting from a find bad lens. And what we'd like to kind of talk through is how to get away from more of that haphazard find bad, approach, and looking at threat hunting more from a methodical, we'll call it planned out perspective. So we're going to be really diving into helping, hopefully the audience understand, what your environments consist of, looking at it from an on-prem. We'll talk a little bit about cloud because obviously the environments have significantly breached past on-prem. And this has been for many years, but now it's becoming more prevalent with the threats out there and so forth. But what we also want to touch base on is, how organizations can understand their business verticals, their physical geographical locations, and so forth. All of this information is really going to help drive the understanding how to go about doing, we'll call it efficient threat hunting, more meaningful threat hunting with more of a high fidelity output. So with that, go ahead and we'll start our discussion here. So one of the first questions here that we're going to be looking at is, all right, we already got some questions here. But let's go ahead and dive into this first question, then we'll go ahead and look at that. So putting together a threat hunt program isn't easy. So some practitioners look at a crawl, walk, run methodology. So Shane, can you go ahead and maybe overview what that looks like and what that consists of?
Yeah, I can actually, but let me pivot back for 1 second before we talk about crawl, walk, run, and kind of define a little bit more about a threat hunt and what it is and what it isn't. You illuminated that it's like a lot of people think it's find bad, which is the worst kind of thing to think about. Because if I find bad, that means you're going to have a bad day because now we've now got an incident. We're no longer threat hunting. We're moving into a different area. But also a lot of people take the premise that threat hunting is, let me put up a SIM, let me put up a bunch of alert functions and I'm hunting. And that's not the case. In the case of threat hunting, what you're doing is you're looking for the things that those alert mechanisms don't look for, behaviors, actions, if you have a true hacker or a attacker on your network, they're not necessarily going to trip those specific types of alerts. But in order for you to even get there, we get to this crawl, walk, run mantra that we preach. And a lot of it is you start to ask your questions about your network, about your people, about who your overall skill sets, and go from a crawl point of view, saying something like, what does my network look like? How many geographic locations do I have? How many subnets do I have? Am I in a vertical that is attacked regularly? What's the attacker profile look like? If I'm in financial services, I have a different threat profile than somebody, say, in oil and gas, or that's in insurance, or that's in medical. And because of that, that means I have to look at, when I'm developing, what my questions are from that point of view. So that's the kind of like that crawl. Start to ask yourself the questions, and then start to ask, how can I answer them? And then from there, you move into the walk, where you're actually starting to be able to answer those questions. And then you can ask even more in-depth questions, and then move into that, like the run, where you're like, I can answer any question you have. Just give me a question and I'll answer it. And we'll talk about that as we go through here, kind of what that means in a little bit more less nebulous kind of way.
Yeah, I think those are some really good points, and in the for the audience to understand also, a lot of this content and discussions that Shane and I will have throughout this hour here, is a majority of this content is covered in our incident response threat hunt training that we do. So a lot of this premise, especially the crawl, walk, run methodology, it's something that is so important from the get-go. It is actually, if you look at almost, I don't know, any topic that you want, people want to go to the advanced stuff, or they want to go to what's going to give them the easiest leg up on things, but without the understanding of the basics, and in this case around threat hunting, and in this case around your environment. If you don't understand your environment, there is no way you're going to be an effective threat hunter. You're going to be continuously looking at these high speed, we'll call them detections that are put out there, or even threats, and without having an understanding of the premise around your environment, that are you even able to see things that you need to see, and so forth. But we're going to get into all of that also around gaps and all this other stuff. But again, first and foremost, understand your business vertical, your physical geographical presence, and your business proprietary information. These are all critical aspects, again, that Shane and I run into, especially around scoping, our threat hunting engagements. Many clients want to do that, the find bad approach, and which is fine. Shane and I can definitely dive in, and we can potentially find bad. But when we have a more structured threat hunt, to build off of, even for the client's perspective, it allows us to provide more fruitful outcome. And again, we're going to outline this, hopefully later on in the content here with the time available. So again, that's why we wanted to start off here, so that everybody understands. If you look at things from this lens, crawl, walk, run, and we're going to beat that dead horse.
Yeah. But just even given that context, Justin, you and I have both been on 2 engagements this week, that if you had just done the basics, you would either know what happened, or you would have been able to mitigate it. The first one was with the person who got their email compromised. They didn't have logging turned on, so we can't tell them anything at that point because we have no telemetry. And the second one was they didn't realize that they had a SQL server exposed to the internet. So, and then it led to like a ransomware event. Those are simple type of things. They're not hard. It's again, the first thing when we talk about baselining and figuring out what your network is, you always get the pushback going, that's too hard for me. My network's too complicated and too big. And my initial response to that is, you take it one step at a time. What's the mantra? How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Yeah.
I'll put it back in your corner there for like, what do you say to people when they say, my network's too complicated and I don't have the personnel? How am I going to do this kind of stuff?
Yeah. So that's kind of a good segue into that because again, we'll call it Twitter X, however you want to refer to that. There's been a lot of, I think, back and forth around baselining, and people get a bad taste in their mouth. Shane and I both come from an operational background, so we 100% understand what this means. We understand the complexity, we understand the time commitment, we understand there's even a knowledge, subset that you need to be able to effectively do this. But instead of looking at the environment as a whole, baselining the whole environment, you take a particular threat, in this case, just solely around threat hunting. You have a threat that you're interested in. What does that threat consist of? What is it actually leveraging within the environment? Okay, great. We know it's using this tool or this lol bin, whatever. Okay, so now we're going to shrink what that baselining looks like to that specific piece of information, build out a process, build a repeatable process, which is the important piece. Do we have existing tooling that can help with this baselining? Because many organizations don't understand EDR. That would be a great example. EDR can 100% help you with your baselining activity. So again, it's looking at, okay, we have limited, staff, we have limited time, we even maybe have skill gaps. Okay, that's not a problem. Do you have maybe the security technology that can help with that activity more from an automated perspective? So again, it's really shrinking down what that actual ask is, and then building out that process and then running with that. And then again, what's the next threat of interest? And so really what you can do is you can almost look at it as a simple exercise of prioritize and execute, right? So prioritize the threats that are important to you. What do those threats consist of? Baseline around those threats and then move your way through it. That would be an effective way to do it without being overwhelmed with baselining your entire environment. So again, it takes that negative stigma around from that word baseline, because everybody kind of cringes when they see it. They throw up the red flag and say, yeah, we can't do it. Just kind of what you already outlined there, Shane. So I think that would be, maybe some examples of how, if I were back in the operational seat, how I would be doing it. But actually, we can use this almost as a segue into how we do our threat hunting too. The way that we approach our threat hunting, or a way that maybe organizations can look at, is you cast the wide net. From that wide net, you shorten or shrink that net based on the output. Because from the output, you're looking at, okay, this is known good. You start whitelisting what that known good is, in a sense, from a query perspective. Then what you're hoping to get is that bubbling to the surface of that potentially anomalous or suspicious activity. That, in essence, is a way that you're actually doing baselining during your threat hunting activity. So again, those are maybe two examples of how you can maybe effectively go about doing your baselining there.
So that actually presents a good segue. There's a question online that asks, how do you go about translating the threat intel into a huntable behavior? And this, again, if you don't have the baseline, you might not be able to even do this. But I'll kind of toss that in your way for a second and see what you think, and I can answer it too.
Yeah, actually, we had one of the topics here. I think we dive into threat intel. Yeah. So around the threat intel, so translating threat intel into huntable behavior. So threat intel, as we all know, again, is one of those topics that people say, okay, threat intel, that's great. But threat intel is actually just a bunch of stuff, right? Especially if you're looking at it from a threat intel feed perspective. So many of the security solutions that you have deployed, they have baked in threat intel feeds. Okay, but what do those feeds mean to you? There's just a bunch of indicators. We'll call it IPs, domains, so forth and so on, right? But are those meaningful to you? So really what you're looking at is, one, do you have an intel threat? Do you have an internal threat intelligence team that can help answer these questions? Most organizations don't. I've only run into maybe a few of the larger organizations that have, solidified threat intel teams that help drive, based on their threat analysis, the threat hunting efforts and so forth. But in lieu of not having that, you can have again, meaningful indicators that are based on your threat profile, exactly what you outlined a little bit earlier, Shane. So again, it's looking at, okay, what are meaningful indicators to us that we should be working off of. There are plenty of threat intel reports that are out there that are either monthly, that are quarterly, that are yearly, that you can base a lot of your intel-based threat hunting around. But again, even with those, are they meaningful to your organization? Do they apply to your business vertical, your geographical presence, the type of actual proprietary information, and so forth? How about yourself? Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, you pointed out a lot of good stuff there. Like you just said, identifying your vertical and if it's even applies to you, kind of like you're also applying that risk. So you can have something that's like an intelligence report, and you may even be vulnerable to whatever that intelligence report is, but do you already have compensating controls in place? Do you have the ability to mitigate it? And that you've already accomplished that so that you can answer those questions. For me, the worst thing when I was working in operations was when somebody came in with a report that a CEO or something going, I just heard about this on NPR. What do we know about it? What can we do? And I'm scrambling to try to answer the question. That was really kind of parts of my introduction to just threat hunting. I wanted to know the answers at least as quickly as they were asking me the question. So I could say something like, oh, we do have that particular application here. It is vulnerable, but we have it behind a firewall and no one's allowed to log into it, or whatever. So I could put the leadership part of it at ease. I could answer those questions rather than going, I don't know, let me look into that. Let me see what we have. And that doesn't have any confidence. And then, the next time there's a riff, I might be on it.
Yeah, so that brings up actually, it almost kind of brings us back to the basics as far as understanding your environment, right? Because you just called that out. If you don't know where, say, like a good one that came out was the ESXi, threat that just was recently out. Okay, most organizations have virtualized environments, but are they susceptible to that, vulnerability or that exploit that was, targeted? Well, again, asset inventory comes in, right? If the asset inventory isn't there for you as a threat hunter to dive into, really what it comes down to is, again, kind of what our mindset is, casting that general wide net. We'll do a general query. Well, first, do you have the tools that allow you that telemetry to find that, through a simple query? But you would have to go out there and blindly, identify, where do we have this? Is shadow ops in play here where they dropped, some, either some infrastructure that you didn't know about, that in a lot of cases, because threat hunting, again, is maybe this is another piece of information from a threat hunting lens. Threat hunting can be a standalone activity, which Shane and I definitely do standalone threat hunting engagements. But from an incident response perspective, threat hunting can run in parallel with a given incident that is at play. And so again, when you're dealing with a scenario like that, you're actually doing, the threat hunting in a reactive perspective. And I think you were touching base on this initially, Shane. And so that would be the reactive. Now, when we're looking at it from a proactive perspective, these are when the engagements happen. When we're doing these proactive engagements, or in this case, we're looking at a particular threat and we're getting ahead of it. Doing some proactive threat hunting there. So again, I know it seems like we're kind of going a little bit all over the place, maybe with thoughts here, but what we're trying to do is kind of tie in these thoughts, to these given scenarios, so it expands the mindset around threat hunting as a whole. Because many people can be maybe jaded in a certain, kind of mindset about what threat hunting is. But hopefully, as we start, continue with this discussion, you can see, how fluid it can be, but then how structured it can be. And then once you find that balance, this is when, later on, maybe in the discussion, we'll talk about, our threat hunt program building training, that we work with clients, and how we get to formalize, kind of a cadence with threat hunting and so forth. But anyhow, that's kind of just some additional kind of context around that. Let's see here. Shane, I don't know if we dove into kind of topic 2 there, or if we kind of glossed over it a little bit.
We kind of hit on a little bit, but we can kind of go in there. So, and I'll kick it off here a little bit. So, a lot of us, when we're doing the training, we discuss things what we call quick wins, sometimes also known as low hanging fruit, or how can I get something that maybe I can put it in front of leadership so I can get even more buy-in and get some political capital, so to speak, so that I can get more resources to do what that is. And that gets back to partially the baseline, but also asking just some simple kind of questions. Something like, can you answer if you have large outbound file transfers, which might be indicative of somebody doing a data exfil? What would that look like? Are you able to get that kind of telemetry? How quickly would you report it? Do you have an alert mechanism that's on that? That might be one of those. Maybe you have like in your core central part of your network where, Active Directory and your core file servers work, that administrators are only allowed to reach those via RDP from jump boxes. Well, if you're looking for activity where there's RDP that's not from a jump box, that could be kind of an alerting mechanism. So you got to set it up in the first place in order to be able to get there. Maybe it's something else like DNS do you have specific DNS servers that are responsible for your outbound traffic? Then you can modify your alert mechanism so that they say, if I see anything it's not these specific servers doing DNS queries outbound, that I need to alert on that because something's going on. Those are quick wins. Usually they're a configuration change or a couple monitoring pieces. And what you're doing is you're taking a question, you're turning it into a kind of a hunt, so to speak, and then you're turning it into an alert. And then once it's alert mechanism, you created it so it has higher fidelity than something that you would get from a organization outside that's canned. Do you have kind of some thoughts on some quick wins, Justin?
Yeah. Yeah. I can kind of piggyback off of exactly what you were saying. So some of the quick wins, again, you're looking at, okay, what does that normal activity look like? And I think you touched base on this with RDP. Another good one is PS-exec, right? So PS-exec, is that a normal admin tool that's, in play? Or, do admins not, do they choose not to use that? In this case, let's just say they chose not to use it. It's just not in play within your environment. So if you were to do a simple PS-exec hunt, you are anticipating 0 hit output for that. So again, that's looking at, understanding what your environment activity looks like. Now, again, you're not taking the whole environment and looking at all network activity and what it consists of. You're taking a very finite piece of information here. As Shane just said, a question. Is PS-exec, utilized in an environment? If it is, okay, great. Let's say it should only be executed and we'll just say best case you have jump boxes, that you pivot off of and so forth. And anything outside of that would be considered, we'll call it suspicious activity. So again, from your threat hunt, you're using source being whatever that would be, and then anything else, that activity was going to, and then anything that went outside of that, there's your hunt output. You've got high fidelity findings and so forth. So again, understanding your environment. But something for those who are also in the incident response space that can, leverage that information that they're, working off of incidents, and they take that into a threat hunting lens or pivot that over into threat hunting activities, RMM tools, come into play. Just coming out of a ransomware case right now where we've got, multiple RMM tools, but only a small subset of those are actually legitimate. So anything else that falls outside of that, that's suspicious activity. That's something that should bubble to the surface. And what you just said also, Shane, is, once the threat hunting activity is concluded, you then polish out those threat hunting queries, turn them into detections, deploy those into your security devices, and then now you have high fidelity alerts that from your SOC, can actively respond to without having that question, is this a fault, is this a false positive? Do I need to dig into this more? This is, again, a very quick approach, to implementing, very solidified alerts based on your threat hunting activity.
No, absolutely. And like you said, with like the RDP and the things like that, RDP might be one of those that shows up as a default alert. So it's going to create a whole bunch of noise, maybe if you have that activity on there. However, if you have that activity domiciled from a jump box to your domain controllers or whatever, where it's known good, you can modify that particular alerting mechanism so that though that's not necessarily your conduit through alerting. You might go check on it, but it's the fact of the matter is that's known good traffic. You're aware of that it should be coming from there versus some arbitrary workstation.
Yeah, real quick. So there was a question here about our guide to successful threat hunting. I think that was back in 2021. We've done a series of webinars. I think post that actual write-up being made, and I think we actually even have a few other blog posts out there. So we'll go ahead and see if we can put those in the notes after, and so that way it's readily available for everyone who can wants to check out the notes after the fact around the YouTube link there. And then one other question here: threat hunting framework or life cycle that you use. In our threat hunting efforts that we do, we basically had built our methodical approach based on our knowledge. We've kind of built the approach around. Actually, I will throw one out there: Palantir ADS. So for those who aren't familiar, the alert detection framework there, we do recommend a lot of clients to use that as a baseline to formalize their threat hunting around. That will give you, at least from a documentation perspective. Then also what we have, or that we've customly put into play, is a testing and validation document that goes hand in hand with that. It's something that we do overview in our threat hunting training that we do. So we walk, the students through what that looks like, how to go about doing that. It builds a very formal hypothesis building approach there, along with all of the supplementing sections. I believe there's like 9 sections within the ADS document, but we also allow students to understand there's flexibility there. You don't have to use all of those sections, but it does give you more of that formalized approach. It allows you to slowly integrate that into your threat hunting, we'll call it program building. But something that we find very valuable, and why we added it to as a supplementing document to that ADS doc, is the testing and validation. Because what that allows you to do, it allows you to do the required threat hunting research. The research around the threat, understanding the threat. Basically, if there's a script you're going to launch, what is that script actually doing? So you're looking under the hood so you understand the threat. You're understanding what telemetry is actually triggered. You're documenting this. And then most importantly, you're creating a repeatable process. So if anyone wants to go about, recreating that hunt around that particular threat, they can look at that package and recreate it. But more importantly, those are living documents also. So it's something that over time, we know threats evolve. And so that given threat, that threat may only encompass, say, one variation of the actual technique that you're looking at, but as it evolves, it now spawns into, say, maybe 2 or 3, variations of that technique. So this is why it becomes, and we talk about this a little bit more in the content today, but documenting your threat hunt activity is part of building out your formalization of your threat hunting activities. So that just kind of spawned off a little bit into that question. So hopefully that answered that question.
And to pivot off of that a little bit, as a threat hunter and as an IR personnel, or many times you're working with SOCs or SOC analysts and whatnot. When you build out your framework, and you can use other frameworks, this is just the one that we use most often, is you help create the alerting and the reporting mechanism that has high fidelity. And that way, SOC analysts tend to get alert fatigue because there's so much stuff coming at them all the time, and they don't know what to ignore versus what they need to ring the bell on, so to speak. And if you have something that that's high fidelity and it comes in at 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm more than happy to answer the phone with you ringing a bell, knowing that it's high fidelity. But if you ring the bell on something that it's just one of the other guys sitting next to you is working on his graduate program and doing a ping sweep, I'm not going to be very happy with you. So the point is that you build these high fidelity type activities so that when it is you're supposed to be reactive, and versus just kind of like, let me investigate it at a slow roll.
Yeah, that actually brings up maybe an important concept to understand too, is threat hunting by itself is, we'll call it, a program. It's an activity that is done. But as one becomes more involved with threat hunting, you'll start to see there is actual, we'll call it bleed over, or think of like a Venn diagram. As Shane called out, threat hunting directly affects your SOC. Threat hunting directly integrates right into incident response. So you can see there's a definite bleed over with your threat hunting activities, which is why there has to be an understanding. Okay, what is the output of our activities? What should we do with it? Is there any formalization to it? Meaning at the higher level, say from a leadership perspective. Other things that we talk about, you can even think of threat hunting at the program level, even being equal to, say, like having an incident response plan. You can have a threat hunting plan that directly relates to your IRP. It integrates. You have that business relationship, at the leadership level and so forth. So that's where we talk about when we get into our threat hunting program building kind of training content. We talk about that, what that looks like, why it's important. Leadership buy-in with threat hunting activities is very important. Again, we talk about, and actually we'll talk about this in the next section, but I'll briefly look at in what you're working towards is you're looking at, what is the ROI of your threat hunting? Because again, we all know security teams are not big. They're not robust. Even when you're looking at the biggest organizations, a threat hunting or a security team is minuscule compared to many other, teams within that organization. So again, you're looking at, okay, what's the level of an investment, but what's the outcome of that investment look like, and so forth. So again, it's really understanding threat hunting from a bigger picture. Those of us in the trenches doing the threat hunting, we can get very, just overwhelmed in what threat, the activity itself. But if you take a step back and really understand, okay, this is the value that you can bring to the organization, threat hunting can drive success at all levels, from the activity itself. So I just kind of wanted to dive into that a little bit more.
That's all good. So on those, we've been talking about baseline, we've been talking about crawl, walk, run, we've been talking about SOCs, we've been talking about a lot of things that would, in most organizations, would be kind of like checkbox kind of activities. I'm crawling at this point now. I've checkboxed that. Let me go ahead and do the walk, and then I'll get to the run. But sometimes we got to pivot a little bit and think about how an attacker might look at things. We're looking at them from kind of a listing kind of point of view. This is what I do next. This is what I do next, X, Y, Z. Where maybe an attacker might look at something a little bit different, maybe in less of a checkbox kind of thing, and more like an algorithm or a graph, so to speak. So you want to kind of talk a little bit about that kind of thought process?
Yeah, it's it's an old adage, right? We've heard it for many, many years, right? Attackers think in graphs, defenders think in lists and those sort of things. But there's nothing wrong with lists. Lists are good to build off of, but it's when you become so kind of, put the blinders on and that's all you're working off of. And again, this is where we definitely hit home around the threat hunting mindset. The threat hunting mindset needs to be more than just list oriented and more than just defender oriented. A good threat hunter is going to look at things that I use this, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. I look at it a triad view. Right. So you look at things from an offensive lens, a defensive lens, and then a triage lens, right? Or a forensic lens. And if you have kind of those three concepts, embedded in your mindset when you're threat hunting, you become far more versed in what the actual outcome of that threat hunt will be. And the reason for that is if you don't understand offensive mindset or tooling, okay, well, you're just going to be looking for, we'll call it maybe indicators of what a tool does, without the understanding of what it's capable of doing, right? And then, if you don't have maybe the forensic understanding, okay, what artifacts or residue is left behind? Okay, well, again, you're limiting the capability in your threat hunting, there. So something that we, again, I kind of just put this out there because, again, training is huge for me. I love the knowledge sharing aspect of things. We do this both in our reports and we do this in our training classes. But one of the best tools that I think out there that any team can use, whether this is going to be your defensive team, and obviously the offensive teams already know this, but Bloodhound is a great tool. It's a versatile tool. It's something that can be used both from the offensive side of things and defensive side of things. So again, if you can understand what that attack graph is actually showing you, you can actually look at, we'll call it the stages of that graph. And when we look at threat hunting too, something to maybe focus on, and this kind of segues right into this, is what does that attack sequence look like? So when you have a detection slash threat hunting, you're actually looking at the phases of that attack and where you actually want to focus on. And then Shane, we're going to touch base on this, or at least maybe we've kind of already subtly done that, is understanding, does your defensive stack cover every piece of that phase, attack? Are you able to see every phase of that attack? Do you have the logging telemetry that you need? Or do you run into gaps? So again, it's really understanding the attacker's viewpoint of their action on objective, right? What are they going after? And then once they kind of pinpoint what they're going after, is how do they get there? And so if you don't have that understanding, you're really going to miss a lot of that attack chain and kind of where to go about doing your threat hunting itself.
Yeah, just kind of pivoting off of that. I mean, you mentioned Bloodhound, which is a great tool. It helps give you kind of like, they say a picture will say 1,000 words. You can see or visualize kind of your network. But also from just an attacker's point of view, once they get into your network, whether it be on a workstation or whatnot, what is their objective? What are they trying to do? And that gets into motivation, means, and opportunity. They've gotten in now. Now, what are they motivated to do? Are they interested in data exfiltration? Are they interested in ransomware? Are they trying to do wire fraud? Well, what is it that's driving them, and can you see it? Just to give you a couple examples of the ones I was thinking of, is you get a threat actor that gets on a laptop, and then the first thing that they want to do is escalate privileges and get to the domain controllers. That's their first, so that they can escalate privilege. But I've also found in some of our engagements that there's a gap when it gets to the servers where the IT staff doesn't want to put EDR on specific servers because they're afraid it might actually affect the overall usage of it. The threat actors know that, and that's where they set up shop in their entrenchment, and they do everything from the server, and they're no longer working from the workstation. Or if they get into the DMZ type of stuff, they set up a bunch of crypto miners, but they don't see the telemetry going back and forth that they're doing crypto mining, and there's a big gap. So those are the kind of like, think about what your threat actors are going to do. What are their motivations? And that's the question. And then if you have that question in mind, how can you answer it? And then how can you mitigate it? So that's just pivoting back off that graph, kind of thinking about how they would move through the actual kill chain.
Yeah, actually, I got one other example there, because this actually spawned off of a TTX we did, but it was for an ICS-based environment. So you brought up, servers not having EDR. Well, in this environment, being the critical nature of the environment, they did not want to deploy a cloud-based, security solution because of the sensitivity of the environment. So in that case, you're dealing with an environment, we'll say, with even farther or further limitations in telemetry, right? So again, if you don't have aggregation of logging telemetry, now you're working with disparate locations of this telemetry. And so this dives into, and I think in one of the other topics we have here, it touches base with this, but we'll kind of plant the seed. It helps you understand, or it helps you potentially look at limitations in where can you effectively do your threat hunting from? Do you have that capability? Do you have the visibility? So those are very important aspects to take into consideration when starting to look at what does formalized threat hunting look like, capabilities surrounding it, and so forth.
Cool. So we've kind of discussed a little bit about quick wins when it comes to kind of pretty low level at the crawl kind of thing. What would say a quick win might look like at, say, a run kind of thing? Do you have any in mind? And if you don't, I have a couple.
Yeah, so looking more at like a mature threat hunting, kind of environment and so forth.
You're pulling in your telemetry. You have your things in place or whatever. What would a quick win on that level might look like?
Yeah, you know what? Even on a quick win perspective too, at say a more mature environment, we're looking at the skill set around this, right? So we're looking at the capability of the threat hunters themselves. Do they know what they're looking for, where to look for it and how to look for it? So I would think even for a mature threat hunting program, in the past, we've worked with, multiple clients building them up to this, mature threat hunting program. And as we were discussing this, looking at it from a personnel perspective, they realized, our current security staff just didn't have the true capabilities they needed to do this. So I would think that's even something, even before getting out of the gate, when you're looking at the walk aspect of things, you're looking at, okay, do we have that capability to be able to handle that? So again, it's really pulling in, through the crawl components of it, through the quick wins, and then building out, what does, the capability of driving home solidified, threat hunts. We're looking at it at the mature environment. We're looking at planned threat hunts now. We're looking at, okay, APT mapping, right? We're looking at using, MITRE Navigator, to build out those heat maps, to really, start to solidify, what these established kind of threat hunt cadence should look like. So again, you're really putting together the formalized approach. And then this is kind of where we kind of bring back home what we were talking about before with the Palantir ADS. So you kind of put this all together, and now you really have that formalized approach being built out along with the ROI components of it. But even some, again, some of the key things within your mature environments is really understanding, your critical segments of the network, right? Where those crown jewels are. It's really, if you have that information now, something that we've done in the past too is we'll take a threat hunt, but we won't threat hunt across the entire environment. We're only going to target those critical networks. And what that, again, when we're looking at data output, we're not inundated with it. We have a smaller subset of data that we're looking at. So now we actually can achieve quick wins because we've narrowed down the scope of what that threat hunt looks like. Now, again, this rides on that hypothesis-based threat hunt. A hypothesis premise being targeting, your crown jewel environment. So that would be, we'll call it just a /24 of your /16 network. That's just, just for discussion purposes. And so with that, we understand that within that /24, maybe we have, 10 critical database servers that would be targeted because that's where the crown jewels go. Okay, great. We're going to focus in on those particular systems of that network and look for this particular threat. So that would be kind of, reining it, down into how you would have a high fidelity, kind of threat hunt, within a very mature environment there.
So yeah, to pivot off of that, a couple that I had one help build for a client was they were collecting outbound DNS telemetry. I said, that's great. Now, what do you do with it? And they just collected it. They would hunt in there if they needed, if they got an IOC or something like that. I said, hey, why don't we create a dashboard? And the dashboard runs, and what it does is it collects the number of hits to that particular DNS query. And then you can flip it reverse. Instead of, you can see what the most domains go to, and you can see the least domains go to. And you have one that goes, 1 or 2 hits down here at the bottom. Maybe you might go investigate those and see what they're related to. Maybe it's a threat actor or whatever. Remember, they're not going to create a lot of traffic as much as your Microsoft.com or your Amazons, because you're going to see those up here at the top. And it's a way of, you've now matured to a point where you collecting the data. Now you're creating actions or actions based on that. Another one was specifically with cloud, where you have developers who are creating the developer instances within the cloud. They were collecting the data so that they could see that was being created. What we ended up turning it into was they were management or leadership got ROI on that, because we found out that the developers were sometimes creating their instances in tenants that were not geocentric to where they were. So it was in other locations, and the data was having to traverse tenants in order to be able to pull stuff across. So we saved them a few dollars by being able to say, hey, create your instances within the tenant where the data exists, and so it's not traversing all of them. So those are other things that when you get to a maturity level, it's not so much as a threat hunt. We're finding configuration issues. We're finding other things that might create problems, and not necessarily on a security point of view, but just a general operational point of view.
Yeah, that's actually cool because that's something again that I think we pride ourselves on. When we're putting together our end of engagement threat hunt reports, that's something that we that we bring to the table from the scoping of the engagement. That yes, we're definitely the first and foremost, the goal and objective is to find bad. But in lieu of finding bad, something that we focus on is for every given hunt that we do, we're not going to just put in there nothing malicious found and kind of go on to the next one. We're really looking at it from the lens that you just called out. Are there any operational security enhancements that we could call out, that we can put in as recommendations? Are there business processes that need to be tuned? Whether it's a stale process that's in place, whether it was, we'll just call it an unknown process, that was put in place, through a finding like an odd FTP transfer that happened to be going out, that was going to a site that no longer needed data and so forth. So again, these are things that we're looking at. So again, from threat hunting, the premise being find bad, yes, but also look at it as a value add through these other topics that Shane and I just kind of brought up. These are the things you can bring in that help solidify that ROI of your threat hunting activities there.
So once you do that, so how do we pivot a little bit from that into, say, like on-prem versus cloud versus other organizations? You're getting these ROIs type of stuff. How do we kind of leverage those? Because they're completely different when it comes to looking at some of this stuff.
Yeah, and so that's something that that adds to the complexity of our engagements, right? It's something as we're scoping out the environment, we're doing a lot of the Q&A, through the scoping. We're helping to gain understanding of the client's environment. Yes, they have an on-prem, but as we get into the discussion, they bring to the table, yeah, we have cloud. Okay, great. You say cloud, but what does that mean? There's many things that encompass cloud. So in one case, is one of our clients has three different environments within cloud. They've got Azure, AWS, GCP. Okay, great. Well, when we're doing threat hunting, to be effective in our threat hunting, we're not going to hit all of those cloud environments as a whole. We're going to have to take each individual cloud environment, because each one has its own subset of threats, own subsets of techniques that are used within those environments and so forth. So again, as you're working on we'll call it formalizing your capabilities around threat hunting, it's just this exactly what we called out here in these kind of few minutes of discussions. Mapping out what your environment looks like. Then from that, okay, let's take a environment or an environment, right? We'll just say like your AWS environment. Okay, now start looking at, okay, what are things that we should start to look for? And again, you start mapping out what some of these threats are, and you put this together. Now this becomes part of your threat hunting cadence. So it starts to build this list. Once you have a solidified list together, say just, again, we're just going to keep focused on the cloud here for a second. What are the most critical aspects of those hunts that you need to look at? So again, prioritize and execute. Smaller teams, maybe you only have one threat hunter. That threat hunter is going to get just burdened with the level of activities that they need to do. But if you help, or that threat hunter is very versed in their own leadership capabilities, they can go ahead and help drive, what are the most prevalent threats to the organization based on their knowledge, and then work with leadership and then, build out that cadence. That would just be some additional feedback there.
And then try to automate as much as you can, so that eventually, so that you don't have to go redo the hunt over and over and over again. You put it in a mechanism where it'll do it on its own.
Yeah, so that brings up a great point too. So this is something that many organizations, this is where leveraging the existing security tools that are in place, because from your threat hunting, you're using what we like to call a little bit more loose queries, right? Because the way a threat hunting query versus a detection query, there is some stark differences, but there's bleed over, because hopefully there is, say, either a SIM admin, someone with a little bit more capability of massaging what that query looks like from a utilization perspective on the back end. Because when you take a threat hunt query and deploy it into, say, production, you want to make sure it's optimized. You want to make sure that, especially from a performance perspective, it's not going to eat up utilization, so forth and so on. We can go on a big tangent there, but just as you talked about, The main premise being after your threat hunting activities, you want to make sure and throw it in, say, as a new detection, because part of your threat hunting knowledge is understanding what do my existing threat or security solutions capable of detecting. Meaning you're not going to have probably the under the hood, secret sauce of each vendor, but you need to understand, okay, what tactics and techniques is it triggering on? How is it triggering? How can I offset that with my threat hunting? And then once you deploy it, it's not going to be a redundant, detection. It's going to be an enhancement to your existing detections. So that would just be some additional things to add there.
Well, cool. So pivoting off of that a little bit and kind of talking about, we've talked about crawl, walk, run. We've talked about baseline. We've talked about the different frameworks for analyzing those kind of things. What about you're kind of starting to feel comfortable. Maybe you've done a few of these things and you're in place. Now you're starting to actually think a little bit more broad for like your attackers themselves, like APT groups and threat hunting in a much broader context. Where can I go to kind of like find more information about stuff like that, like APT groups and how they activate, so that I can actually put in a threat hunt that's that way?
Yeah, for sure. Now, this stuff again, this is, especially working with students in our class and so forth. This is actually a really cool part of it because again, there are many different frameworks out there, many different, we'll call it tools out there, but something we kind of just go back to, and this is just because it's community driven, it's constantly updated, but it's by no means not, the end all be all, but it's a very good solid framework to at least get going with and to map against. And the MITRE attack framework is something that we go back to. It's easy to map against, but it's very easy, as we talked about, as a supplemental piece of this, the MITRE Navigator, it builds the heat maps based off of the framework. So you allow yourself to build, upon this. From this, you can actually take APT groups of interest that are specifically targeting, again, your business vertical, right? Maybe the type of data that you have, if you're more technology driven or financial driven, so forth, and you have specific software, or applications that you run. Geographical presence is another big one because as we know in incident response, or even on the threat intel side of things, is certain APT groups are going to target specific geographic regions. And so again, this is how you kind of put those together. So as part of our threat hunting engagements, as we look at it from scoping, what we try and do is we'll take a subset of APT groups and maybe even a malware family. We'll put those together into the MITRE Navigator and we build out what that threat heat map looks like. And from that, what it's going to do, it's going to overlay the techniques, that those APT groups and that, malware families use. And then what it'll do is actually aggregate, the most prevalent techniques, that those groups use. From those, you can then start to build out and do your research around those techniques and the variations of those techniques to identify, okay, what are some of the tooling out there that, that leverages these techniques? And then now you can build out a very strict hypothesis-based, threat hunt around that. So again, this is where, working with just clients or students and what have you, it really brings it back home to say, okay, I'm actually less stressed. I have a way to, get out of the gate. Again, it may not be what you end up with, but it is a good starting point to get you to start to map it out. Because again, as you're communicating to leadership, and we briefly talked about ROI, it's a good metric building capability.
Cool. I know we're getting close to the end. I'm going to put you on the spot with one that we didn't talk about before and see what you think of it. So how would threat hunting have helped with the mitigate or help with the CrowdStrike incident?
Oh, interesting.
You've got a supply chain activity there, which wasn't really, I mean, we talk about supply chain attacks all the time when we talk about threat hunts, but I didn't know if you had any thoughts on it. I kind of have a couple that I've come up with since then, but I just want to see if you had any thoughts about how a threat hunt might have helped or not helped.
Well, depending if you were depending if you were leveraging, in our case, CrowdStrike for your threat hunting activities, right? So
yeah, there you go.
Yeah, so again, but actually something that actually came about from that, I think a lot of organizations actually identified their percentage of deployment. where they thought they had 100% deployment, and they actually had some systems that were still up and running, unbeknownst to them, because they thought based on operations, yeah, we have 100% deployed, EDR, presence within our environment, and come to find out that it wasn't deployed. There was a subset of systems out there, maybe more test bed type systems, what have you, but still that's a point of understanding the environment, right? That, again, this is baselining the environment. Yeah, as far as threat hunting, again, it's around that would have been something that from an agent perspective, though, that could have been something that could be used as a threat hunt to solidify, do we actually have 100%, scaled, security tool? That's something you could do. You could take the agent, the hash value right there. Okay, now we know based on subnets that are out there, we're just going to go ahead and do a quick application understanding of, said tool. Is it actually truly deployed? We're not going to use the EDR to say, here, we're 100% deployed, but we're actually going to use, in the case, this would be a pseudo light, threat hunting exercise to identify that. But you can go ahead and expand on that.
Yeah, I was thinking a couple other aspects of it that you might have been able to either pre or post determine the number and version of clients that you might have there. Maybe it might not have been compatible with the actual update. The other part was more on the supply chain type of activity, because we do identify this in threat hunts when the client focuses on that particular in and outbound egress type of activity. It's usually more around the developers and the things that they do, like libraries and tools that they kind of bring in. And in that case, usually what we're talking about is it comes to a staging area where it's tested before it actually gets into the environment proper. And that may be something that becomes a takeaway here, that you identify this as a supply chain. You create that mechanism by which it's supposed to come into a specific sandbox, if you will, then deploy. But the threat hunt that comes after that is to make sure that all the clients are participating in the sandbox and not going back out later after you've made that configuration change. This is, again, back to that. We identify configuration issues more often than not in some of our threat hunts.
Yeah, so it also piggybacks off of, in lieu of not using the EDR in this case to do the threat hunt, do you have that other log source that would even be able to achieve that threat, that hunt that we're talking about, down from a software version? Now, something that could be thought about, maybe it's not actually a security tool, maybe it's an IT tool, right? So these are things, that threat hunters need to understand. And this is something that we impress upon them is, do you have the necessary access to the tooling that you need, not only for threat hunting, but in this case, as we've talked about, that is very important. But it comes down to almost like IT related tools, because those IT related tools help you understand the environment. Subnets come into play. Do you have an IP management, piece of software that's in play that you can have access to, that you can identify? Asset management, is there a separate tool that you need access there? So forth and so on. So again, thinking outside of security, but thinking as a whole, because to me, an effective threat hunter is one who understands the environment, and again, not with blinders, but with a holistic view of the environment.
Awesome. That was a great kind of closing thought. We've got like another minute or so to go, but I would just, right on top of that is that crawl, walk, run type of activity. First, you crawl, understand your environment. And it could be as simple as starting out with just understand the subnets that you have in play. Talk to your router guy. He's going to be the guy that's going to know that more than anybody. Look at your DHCP scopes, start to pull that in. Then once you do that, ask the next question. How many machines do I have on the network that are Windows versus Linux versus Mac? Where's my infrastructure core points? Where are my routes? Then you're starting to move into that next level of activity. Then it's what applications are on my network? How do they interact? How do they work between each other? Do I now have cloud presence? Where's my ingress and egress points? What type of VPN do I have? What type of web exposures do I have? All those type of activities. If I jump out real quick and do maybe I do some open source intelligence, looking at what from the outside in, what my organization looks like to it from an attacker who just Googles me and try to figure things out there. What's my exposures? Keep moving itself up. then automate it and start to build off of that, say, build dashboards and dashlets and reports and try to create ROI for what it is that you're trying to do. Because if you can prove value, then you will be able to build a good system from there, and you'll get buy-in not only from your internal people, but you'll get buy-in from leadership. And leadership is where the core of it is, because they're going to be the ones that inevitably say, move it up the chain, that says this is important, and then we can do things from here. I will segue one other thing. Is another thing you can also implement there is in side by side with threat hunts are like tabletop exercises where you actually walk through that like an incident process, and you can use the mechanisms that you walk through that, like what would a ransomware attack look like on your network. Now let me pivot that back to how would I threat hunt for it? How would I answer the questions? What was the initial attack vector? How did they get through? How did they pivot laterally? How would I recover? What does my backups look like? How far back can I go on backups? All that retention policy. Those are all questions that threat hunts put into, but I'll get off my soapbox.
I was just going to say, that's what I think I dig a lot about, being part of incident response and how we segue that knowledge into our threat hunting. So anyhow, we're going to conclude today. So, thanks for everybody, for being here, listening to us have this little chat. I do want to say, if you're obviously interested in learning more, we definitely have, a ton of blogs out there. We have, pre-existing webinars, I think, that were recorded prior to this. We also have our training that we put in, that we've talked about it, throughout. We have a threat hunting program building training, and we have a threat hunting workshop. Program building is a little bit more lengthy. We have 2 weeks built in there, and then our threat hunt workshop can be a 1 or 2 day class. But then also, we have our threat hunting engagements, that Shane and I and a few other on the team, participate in. So if you're interested, definitely reach out. But again, thanks for everybody's participation.
Thank you much. Have a good day.